Hi everyone, welcome to a new video of Holdem Manager 2. I'm going to show you how to create your own HUD in this video, and I'm going to explain what stats you should actually put in. So you need to click on Home, then you need to click on HUD Settings. So my own personal philosophy is to add only pre-flop and flop stats to the HUD, and as for every other stat, I would tend to look at the pop-ups. So I prefer to rely more heavily on pop-ups because I don't have a very big monitor screen. I'm using a single monitor setup, and I generally don't like to have clutter, so I tend to use pop-ups more. But if you have like dual or triple monitor setups, and if you have a lot of space, then or if you are playing fewer tables and you can expand your table, then you should have more space to use a larger HUD and add more stats to them. So here we have Daniel's basic HUD setup. I'll just create a new one. So first we want to design our HUD. I think the default HUD comes with name and total hands, and I think you should leave that in. Then you can add a new line by clicking here. So you can see that it creates a new line, or you can double click it to remove it. Next, I think you should add VPIP and PFR. These are like the basic, so I'll generally just add the total VPIP and PFR. And then you can add steal. I don't really like to use the steal number on its own. It could be a decent indication of how loose or tight a player is when he raises in late position, but I generally prefer to use the positional stats. So I do add a steal there, but I attach a pop-up to this particular stat so that I can see my opponent's positional stealing range. Next is fold to steal. So Daniel is using this stat. I don't really use this stat because once again I'm using the pop-up. So I have a pop-up attached to it, and it has the positional fold to steal. So if you are looking for a particular stat and you're not sure where to find, you can just click on the search stats button. So I can just type like big blind fold to steal, for example, if I want to look for this particular stat. But yes, I would have that stat in a pop-up attached to this particular stat. So generally the first line will contain basic pre-flop stats. So for the next line, I like to have the 3-bet and the fold to 3-bet numbers. I think these two numbers do help us tell a very good story on how our opponent's actually playing. So we have the 3-bet. You can also type it in total 3-bet, yeah. Total fold to 3-bet. Post-flop aggression factor. I personally don't really use aggression factor these days unless our opponent is a weak player, because most racks tend to have an aggression factor of 2 to 3, and it doesn't really doesn't give us a good idea on how he's actually playing, because I would prefer to look at flop c-bet, turn c-bet, river c-bet stats. Okay, so next stats we would want to add is the flop c-bet and the fold to flop c-bet. So I think this is pretty good. We tend to find ourselves in flop situations where we are the caller or we are the pre-flop aggressor. So if you are the pre-flop aggressor, you would want to know how often your opponent is folding against a flop c-bet. And if you are the caller, you would want to know how often your opponent is actually c-betting. So we can have a better idea on how strong his c-betting range is. Next is flop dong bet. I do not recommend putting this stat in. It's not very useful since most players do not really lead the flop. I guess you can attach this particular stat to a pop-up, but what you'll often find is that you don't really have a sample size for donk betting. So Daniel also has a when to showdown when soft flop after calling PFR. I don't think that's very useful. So I would actually remove these two stats. I would also recommend removing AF. I guess you can leave it in, that's okay. So with this, we actually have all the fundamental stats. So if you want to be more specific, although I would tend to rely more on hearts, then you can go into like positioner raise first in stats. So RFI. So early position raise first in. Okay, it's lagging a bit. Middle position raise first in. Total raise first in is fairly useless, I think. Next, we can have like steal. So the cutoff steal is the same as the cutoff raise first in, just that a raise first in from late position is called a steal basically. So I guess it's a bit confusing for beginners. Cutoff steal, button steal, small blind steal. So I guess at a quick glance, you can roughly know how wide your opponent is opening from every position. And these stats tend to be useful when you have a really large sample, but assuming you are playing NL2 like Daniel is, you would probably have less than 1,000 hands on your opponents. So all these sample sizes will be very insignificant, small. So they will not be high enough for you to make a good educated guess on. They won't be high enough for you to have a very accurate picture of your opponent's actual opening range. So you would need to look at his overall VPIP and PFR, and then come up with your own educated guesses on how your opponent is playing in a particular position. Okay, so I am trying to add the stats in. I don't think you can double click, you need to click on the left arrow if I'm not wrong. Yes. Okay, so perhaps in this first line we can have like all the raise first in stats. You could also have positioner 3 bet, but once again I think this stat might not be so useful at NL2 when you have no sample. You might need to actually buy hands from a hand history website such as hhdealer.net. So you can have like 3 bet in position by position, like EP 3 bet, MP 3 bet, cut off button. So it seems I've added the wrong stat here. It should be the same as the others. So cut off 3 bet. And of course you can have like small blind 3 bet and big blind 3 bet. You could even be more specific. Like for example, I personally use I have a table. So I've like on the x-axis I have EP to small blind, and on the y-axis I have MP all the way to the big blind. So in every position you can find out your opponent's actual 3 betting range, and this is extremely useful if you have a very huge sample size of tens of thousand hands on your opponent. So you would actually need to data mine and buy hands from the sites I've mentioned earlier, but I think for NL2 that is probably not necessary. So you'll probably find yourself not having a very large sample, but it might be good to add these in. But I would actually strongly recommend leaving it in your pop-ups. You might want to add turn c-bet. I think that would be pretty useful. You could add that in your HUD. I personally have it in my pop-up as well. Turn c-bet, river c-bet. Turn fold to c-bet. Turn fold to c-bet. And river fold to c-bet. Yeah, so I think that's fine. And as I said earlier, I think AF isn't all that useful, but sometimes fishes tend to have widely varying AFs on each street. Especially, I think there are many passive players who tend to be very passive on the earlier streets, but their river AF will be like 4 or 5 or even higher, like 10. So I think it's good to have like river AF, it might be useful. So river AF, flop AF. Of course, you will need to take these stats in context. You need to know his overall AF. So I guess I'm kind of contradicting myself earlier. I don't think it's that useful against most players, but against some fishes, it's very useful. I think it's another post-flop aggression factor. You can also learn how to use aggression frequency. Yeah, so I think all these stats should be enough. You can actually split them into 2 lines if you want. And the positioner preflop stats, you could leave it in. Plenty of players leave these stats in. I personally don't like to leave them in. Yeah, so I think this should be enough. You can adjust the HUD however you like. Okay, next is the stat appearance. Some players like to change the way their stats look. You can actually adjust the stats according to color. So you can just click wherever and it will be red. So if I want to change the color of this stat, I can just change it to blue. So it's changing here. It's a bit small, but I think it's changing. You can also set the HUD to change such that when it's of a particular value, it will be of a certain color. So sometimes if people's VPIP and PFR is too high, it means it's probably a loose passive fish. So perhaps if it's very high, you might want to make it green. So maybe if it's more than 50, it is green. If it's less than 50, perhaps it could be pink. Okay, maybe 20. So someone with less than 20 is probably a nit. So I'll give him a pink color. Someone with a 20 to 28 VPIP, perhaps I might want to label him as a solid aggressive regular. So I could label it as red. And then anything looser. So if we can set the final color to be green if he has a VPIP of more than 28. Yeah, so your opponent's VPIP will change according to the rules you have set here. So it's useful if you want to have a very quick way of identifying your opponent. I don't use this personally, but plenty of players do. So I think it's a matter of personal preference. For me, I just if you have watched my videos, you'll know my HUD stats are very colorful. I just use every color I can. Okay, so what other settings can we change? I guess all these aren't that important. I wouldn't recommend hiding hero HUD. I think you should look at your own stats so that you are aware of your own image for that particular session. Use session stats. You can just double click on the black area on your HUD and it will turn red if you want to know how you are playing in that particular, how your opponent is playing in that particular session. But for your hero HUD, you will always be showing your session stats. Okay, this isn't too important. Pop-up designer, I think it's fairly important. So I can just create a new pop-up and show you how I would go about creating my own stats. So for example, I want to make a 3-red HUD for myself. So I click no, I want to start from the beginning. So earlier I did mention that I tend to have a grid. So I want to know how a player is 3-betting from a particular position against someone's open race from a particular position. So at the bottom you can add new columns and new rows. I'll just keep adding a few. So we have like MP cut off. So this isn't that important for now. You can add it in if you want. But yeah, as I said earlier, you probably won't have the sample size to use this properly, but I'm just showing you how to go about creating your own pop-up. What does a pop-up do? It just allows you to see more stats. Yeah, so the HUD can only show you so much information. So imagine if all the pop-ups, the information displayed on all the pop-ups were displayed at the table at the same time, it would just fill up the whole screen. So I think just imagine you have a desk with many drawers. There's not enough space to just put all your documents on a table, so you want to keep some in a drawer, and that's basically what the pop-up is. Yeah, so I'm basically just writing stats. I'm just labeling the stats. So this number, this will not change. These cells will not change. Basically, the y-axis is the opponent's opening range, open raise frequency, and the x-axis is the opponent who is 3-betting. So for this particular first cell, the number represents how often someone is 3-betting from middle position against an early position open raise. And in this particular cell, the 3-bet stat will show how often the big blind is 3-betting against a small blind open raise. So next, you can either click on search stat or you can just find the positional stats. So we have like big blind 3-bet versus EP. I'll just keep slotting all the stats in. Big blind 3-bet versus MP, cut off, button, and small blind. Yeah, so you can just keep repeating the process for each of the positions. Yeah, so you can also change the appearance of the HUD. So there's like text color. So you can just put for one cell first. Click on this, change the color if you want. So you see I made the changes to one cell. And the pencil button will appear, so you can just click on any cell you want to edit. You can also change like the font. So I tend to use Arial. If the pop-up looks very small, I would recommend just increasing the font. So maybe all cells. Yeah, so it's a lot bigger now. You can also bold if you want. You can change the background color. You can add borders to the table as well. So for example, I want to add a border to this table. Yeah, you can select the area which you want highlighted. So now this will be drawn like that. So in this cell, you can set it to look like that. And you can just continue and you can see it appearing in your HUD, which we will show you later. Anything else? Yeah, cell background. You might want to color the cell differently, maybe a yellowish color, a pale yellow. Yeah, so if you have a very huge pop-up with a lot of information, I think a good way to separate the color is to use the background color. Okay, so that's all for pop-ups. You can create a lot of custom pop-ups, but as a beginner, I think most of the stats I did recommend you should suffice. Okay, let's see whether I'm missing out anything. Okay, so hard filters by number of players. I think this is important. So if your table starts to break, or if you are starting a table, I think it's very important to filter by number of players. Someone playing heads up is going to be playing extremely differently from someone playing in a 6-player game. So I think you should set the filters. So if there are 3 to 4 players, you want to be using hard stats which are filtered for that particular situation. And if you are playing heads up against someone, you only want stats recorded of his heads up play to be displayed, because it really makes no sense for your opponent to be playing the same range if he were playing heads up and if he were playing in a 6 max game. So generally I would just set it to something like that. So if you have 5 to 6 players at the table, his stats for a 5 to 6 player game will be displayed. Yeah, and heads up, you will only get 2 players. 3 to 4 players, you'll get 3 to 4 player stats. Full ring, maybe 7 to 8, I guess, and 9 to 10. Or maybe 7 to 10. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so something like that should work. Mix fast and non-fast hands together. I think people tend to play similar ranges in both types of games. So I think you should just mix it in. Includes hands from other limits. I think you should. I don't think people's playing style will change all that much between various limits. And of course, I'm assuming if you're not buying hands, you're going to have very limited sample sizes on your opponent. So I think you need all the sample you can get. And as for filter by date or number of hands, I don't think you should change any of these. Next, we have hotkeys. You can use the hotkeys if you want. I don't use the hotkeys, so that's fine. Okay, so one more thing to note. Just now, earlier on, I did not talk about this part of the stats appearance. So if you recall earlier, I did just design a 3-bet pop-up in the pop-up designer. So, but how do I actually activate this particular pop-up? I would need to attach it to a particular stat in the HUD. So you go to stat appearance, and I click on the stat I want to attach my pop-up to. So in this case, I want to see the pop-up whenever I mouse over the total 3-bet stat. And then I go to pop-up, I click on 3-bet. And yeah, I guess we are done with this part. So let's see the results of my earlier configuration. So I guess you can just open any random hand and then you can have a look. So you can see on the replayer window, we are still using the default 2.0 HUD, which Daniel is using. That's his own HUD. But I can change the setting to change it to the new HUD which I just created. So I can just click this. Okay, so now our new stats are being shown. you can see that the HUD is extremely small, so I would actually go and increase the font size for all the stats. So that's the first thing I would notice. Let's try to mouse over the 3-bet set. So I think this 3.9 number is his 3-bet stat, if I'm not wrong. Let's mouse over this, and there you have it. So let's try to interpret this information. So Daniel 3-bets a very similar range in all positions, and he doesn't really vary his 3-betting range based on how wide his opponent's raising. So 2%, 3%, 2%, 3% from every position against early position, 3%, 3%, 3% in cut off small blind button, cut off small blind and big blind against MP, and 5%, 6% against a cut off open. I guess it's increasing as we go into later positions, so that's good. 6%, 8% against a button open, which is fine. People tend to open the widest from the button. 5% in the big blind against the small blind open. I guess this number should be higher than the button opening range, since in the big blind we have position against the small blind, and the small blind is probably opening really wide as well. So I think this number could be 10% or more. But okay, that's not the main point of this video. So as you can see, the pop-up is indeed working, and so are the stats. So earlier we did set a color filter for the VPIP. So if our VPIP is in the normal range, it will be colored red. If our opponent is too nitty, like this guy's VPIP is below 20, it's colored purple or magenta. 17 is also the same color. And this guy is very loose and passive. If it's more than 28, it will be colored as green. So you can see the HUD is actually working fine. So that's all for this video. Do let me know your feedback and leave your comments in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and good luck at the tables.